Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another one of these short videos that me and John are hosting, putting together from Antioch. Some insights into what it means to be Antioch and what we're all about. And today we're looking at the history of Antioch and how
Antioch the network, not Antioch.
That's right.
Stay
If you know
tuned.
your Bible, you know what we're talking about. Antioch the network in Manchester. How this network was started, the history of it. Our history is me and John, and some of the sort of characteristics of what it means, and we'll unpack those a little further. You know, that some of you'll know that there's some characteristics of this network, particularly the fact that it's split into two. But don't worry, there will be more news and updates on those particular details. But today is just to get a bit of a picture of what Antioch is, I guess, and its history. So, John, why don't you start off?
Yeah, like you say, Ben. I mean, like each of us have got our own story, and the story of Antioch is in some way those things kind of coming together to make Antioch. So I guess my story starts. I grew up somewhere that was very affluent. I grew up in the church that grew quickly, but it was a biggish church, and it wasn't actually till I went to Africa when I was 24 years old I really began to look into church planting. What does it take to see churches growing in soil where there hadn't been churches before? And looking into that really gave me sort of an insight into what does it take to grow people and to see people go from not knowing Christ to wanting to lead and support and sort of almost be sort of pillars in the church. And so that was a huge question that I was sort of grappling with for nearly 20 years really in Africa. Then coming back to Manchester, again, still not like super focused on church planting in England. But seeing as I came back to England in about 10 years ago, just how effective the church could be as it adapts these kind of rapidly changing environments. We talked about in the first video, the way that culture changes, stuff changes, and really almost picking that question up in 2012 when one of the leaders in the church that I just started working in, which was a self-appointed church, says, well, what are we doing? What do we do? And what are our groups for? And then we began to talk about how we wanted to grow as a church. What would it take to grow? And we said, we're not going to grow into a bigger church. We're not going to keep sort of institutionalizing, because other churches do that better than we can. So we set ourselves to grow, which was kind of ridiculous at the time, into a church planting movement. We just said, like, when we get bigger, we're going to plant another church for all the reasons that we talked about last time. We're going to open up to new people. We're going to grow our leaders. And so that was the goal that we set ourselves, and we grew. And so we divided into two churches, and that was the kind of really interesting. I mean, it was like cutting a plant back, pruning these plants. People left. Our growth went from sort of, I don't know, whatever, 30% a year to minus 20. It's like, God, what's happening? But then we saw that growth kicking back off. And yeah, we wanted to do it again. We wanted to keep growing, and we realized that we couldn't do it just in a little corner. And that was the point where we kind of went to the diocese and said, well, would you give us permission? Would you give us permission to keep planting, to put new small groups of leaders into different places among the poor, which is obviously an Antioch theme, and among the diverse poor on our track, because I know we're going to come on to yours. And at that point, the diocese said, hey, obviously we're listening, and we'll pick that story up later. Yeah. So that was how we, on the diverse side, almost sort of these different things came together to make us say, look, these kind of communities, these kind of churches, this is how we want to grow leaders. This is how we want to make disciples. This is how we want to evangelize. And those were the kind of things that almost led us into that desire to become a church planting movement.
Mm.
So what about you, Ben? How was it? Because obviously I was working with you when that 10, 11 years ago, when we first got back to Old Trafford, and neither of us were like talking too much about church planting.
No, we weren't. Well, my story starts. I became a Christian at 16. I was baptized, and then 2 weeks later, really clearly felt a call to a state ministry, council estate ministry. And then I was born in Fulwood, Preston, if you know that well. It's a sort of posh suburb of a working class sort of city now. And then, but a few weeks later, I went on a mission trip to Manchester. I was a 17-year-old kid, lived on this little terrace street in Clayton, Manchester, and that's where my eyes were open, and the Lord said, "This is where you're going to spend the rest of your life, ministering in these places, and bringing the gospel, and being part of church." And so that was that. And over the years, been on the States now for just under 20 years, across the northwest of England. Met my wife, and then Amy had a very similar call. So we did Eden for most of our 20s, actually, which is an Eden project, and that's a sort of a ministry based at the Message Trust in Manchester, where Christians in the main move into a council estate and begin to share the good news of Jesus there. And so that's where me and John first connected. We were at the same church, and yeah, church planting wasn't on my radar then. All I knew was that I wanted to see people off council estates convert to Christ, to meet Jesus and give their lives to him. And for me, there's a story progression there, and I'll get onto that now, really. In that time, alongside John, we both had a call to ordain ministry, which was hilarious and frustrating and confusing, but
for other people as well as us.
Yeah, that's right. But it turned out to be correct. So we went off to college, and I came back to Manchester Diocese to my curacy, where I said very clearly to the diocese, look, two things. I need to be on a council estate, and I need to be planting church. Two things. I'd become convinced that church planting was the way that you were going to reach these places. And then, so we started Oldham's Church, and that grew in it, and we started to see fruit. And then I think the next step along, so my first call really, was to see people give their lives to Jesus on the estates. And then it progressed, and it was like, not only that, now to become disciples of Christ in those places. And then thirdly, raise up and grow Indigenous leadership, local leadership.
And that's almost the one that takes you deep into church planting, isn't it? Because you can evangelize people, you can grow disciples in any kind of church, and just grow.
That's right.
It's that third step that's so
critical. And then me and John started to have conversations about how this thing could grow a little, how we could develop. We'd been involved both in church plants, and I think it was at that point, spending time with you actually, that you this idea that actually so the fourth stage for me was, you need to be planting, multiplying churches. That almost the life of a healthy church plant, something happens at around the 5 to 7 year mark, something changes. And that was spending time with you actually, and I'd say that was the fourth stage in my sort of calling progression and that. And so that whole pattern that is there really, from conversion, discipleship, leadership, to replanting, to planting out. And so we've not done that with Oldham's Church yet. We're about to do that. We're about to plant out of Oldham's Church. And what I've noticed with estate ministry is they're a lot more stagnant, both the way they're made up as communities, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of graft, and you want to be building on good foundations whilst having that vision of, we're going to go soon. Some of us are going to be chucked out of this church and sent off, like you experienced. And then that's where we sort of met, and Antioch, I guess, was born. And maybe you could share the next stage in that journey, John.
Yeah, so I mean, almost like just sort of taking it back to a little bit before that. As we were, like I was a year ahead of you in the ordination process, right? Yeah. And so we were coming up to that kind of critical time, and I was thinking, okay, well, we want to be a church planting movement. What happens now? And I was going to Diocese in Manchester, particularly it was going to Bishop Mark Ashcroft, Phil Rawlings with me, and we said, look, would you give us permission to plant? And that's what we call a BMO, which we'll maybe talk about another time. You know, would you give us permission to plant? Maybe slip us a bit of funding. You know, help us to replant. Particularly, this was in North Manchester and Cheetham Hill, and at that point, the diocese said, kind of almost words to the effect of "Go big or go home." And it's like, oh okay. And by go big, they meant, well, you know, maybe the church commissioners would be interested in picking this up. And then, you know, at that point, I thought, well, going big means, we can't just do this on our own. And obviously, you know, you were there planning churches. And that was the point where we sat down and it kind of grew more from a kind of friendship thing into kind of a ministry partnership. It was like, if we're going to go big, if we're going to like make an impact, if we're going to be something that the Diocese of Manchester can own and talk to, then, you know, we want to work together.
Yeah.
And, you know, out of that, do you remember that kind of sitting in the bishop's leadership team? And it's like, what you know, like small to small church planting is diocesan policy.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
I remember feeling nervous and just going through to the meeting thinking, what are we doing here? Like, but just take our hats off to the courage and the sort of the diocese and the
across the team.
Yeah.
Like across the team. It wasn't just one. That was amazing. And then obviously church commissioners came on board, and then we had to go through this process of getting the BMO. Again, we'll talk about some of the mechanics of that later, but I remember us thinking, you know, both of us thinking this idea of, yeah, we're sailing the kind of same boats, but they may be rigged a little bit differently over on the estate side as opposed to the diverse side. But there's that natural connection of vision. And B, we knew that we needed to network these church plants. Mm. Because we've seen so many church plants just burn out. Yeah. You know, there's so many people out there saying church planting is going to solve everyone's. It's like, it's not. It's not. And we saw that the people who were church planting well were in a network. And so we felt that we didn't just want to be like a marriage of convenience. It wasn't just about working our sides around what happened with a grant or with a BMO or with a diocesan process. It was really about supporting one another, growing one another in ministry, and also for you and me and, you know, Amy and Janice, you're actually challenging one another to grow in Christ, because it can be just a very kind of isolating thing. And almost those are the different strands that I guess brought the network together. Yeah, there's the funding strand, there's the diocesan governance strand, there's the strand of friendship, there's the strand of knowing that we have to support one another and learn and get better at what we're doing and grow as a community, which is, yeah, I mean, I guess going back to that sort of Antioch vision, like a brotherhood of church planters. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's kind of where we've got to now. We're constantly looking at like, how can we grow these congregations, but how can we also sort of grow together as a sort of rope of many strands, you know, that's not easily broken. So yeah, I guess that's how we got to where we are today in terms of like an Anglican structure in the Diocese of Manchester, but also like a brotherhood of church planters working together. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, helpful. But I think you need to finish with a very important detail, that where many of our engine room meetings, where do we have our engine room meetings, John, me and you, and maybe a couple of others in there? You're looking confused, but you know it is there. Where do we meet?
In Wetherspoons.
In Wetherspoons.
In Wetherspoons. Yeah, Wetherspoons is our diocesan office.
It's where we meet, and we've had some amazing meetings of scheming, of planning, of calling each other out when we've not done what we said we'd do, and it's all been in the context of the Wetherspoons, where you have got, if you know your Wetherspoons, you've got a plethora of characters, and it keeps you grounded.
And it helps you, yeah. And like sometimes sort of, I think one of the things I appreciate is the chart. it's like you're so different from me,
Yeah.
and like I think I really appreciate that. I just think with that, actually, it's fantastic working as a network where people have different strengths, different gifts,
Mm.
and are actually able to see what the Lord is doing and what He's challenging us to do because we're different. And so that's been a massive encouragement.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And the next couple of videos are going to be looking into some of the mechanics, I guess, of how Antioch works. We're hoping to get Bishop Mark to help us talk about what a bishop's mission order is, and so that there'll be the next few videos.
How that came to birth, the joy and the transitory pain of bringing bishop's
That's right.
mission.
That's right.
All right.
Brilliant.
All right.